This episode of The Energy Show is proudly sponsored by Sunlight and Power, the Bay Area's leading commercial and residential solar contractor. SLP has been designing and installing photovoltaic, battery backup, and solar thermal solutions since 1976. Help fight climate change. Go solar with Sunlight and Power today.
So, you want to save the world with clean energy? Make money doing it? Confused about the economic and technical realities of residential and commercial solar, batteries, heat pumps, EVs? Want the real-world scoop on new energy technologies, not manufacturer hype? Then tune in to the Weekly Energy Show, hosted by Barry Cinnamon. Insights from Barry's 40-plus years in the solar and energy industry will help you understand the future ways we'll generate and consume energy. And now, here's Barry.
Welcome to this week's Energy Show. Now, as you know, my company, Cinnamon Energy Systems, provides complete electrification services for customers in the Silicon Valley area. But it is really hard to provide accurate advice about the ideal way to electrify your home. There's so many variables. And I learned about this firsthand when I electrified my 50-year-old San Jose house in 2019. I had to hire 5 different contractors, one for the solar and battery, one for insulation, one for the heat pump water heater, one for the heat pump HVAC system, and then an electrician to do the electrical panel upgrade. Now, luckily, the contractor doing the solar and the battery knew what they were doing, but I really had to step everybody else through. It's like, why the heck was I going through all these changes at once? It's not too hard to determine the costs for each one of these contracting categories. You know, get 2 or 3 quotes, and I added them up, and I looked to see who was best, not necessarily the cheapest, but the best. But it was really complicated to figure out the savings from all these measures, and the contractors didn't really know about any incentives and didn't really know how to do any energy modeling. And then sort through all the various tax credits and rebates to get to a simple payback number, and then figure out how to prioritize the projects. So there's a lot of demand for electrification, obviously a lot of demand for solar, and so there's a big demand for ways for contractors to make it easy for people to electrify their homes, and for software that will help contractors model the systems, figure out the incentives, and get financing. So that brings us to a new company, Balto Energy. They focus on accelerating electrification, and really kind of the starting point is solar. So it's solar-led electrification. Their CEO, James Quazi, is our guest today. He's got terrific experience with home energy modeling, previously co-founder of Dandelion Energy, which was a spin out of Google X, and we were just talking about us going back, to the early 2000s in sustainable spaces. So Balto's goal is to provide software for contractors to make it easier for homeowners to electrify their homes. So with that introduction, welcome to the show, James.
Thanks, Barry. Happy to be here.
All right. So first, I'm a longtime solar contractor. I really like the concept of solar-led electrician. I like to be a leader. But what do you mean by solar-led electrification?
Yeah, I think the simplest explanation is that to the extent that homeowners want to electrify their homes, if they do that with grid electricity, the economic outcome for them will be worse, definitively worse, than it would be if they did that with solar and batteries.
And so are you partnering with the solar contractors kind of to begin with, or just, they're a key part of this effort to completely electrify?
Yeah, I think the solar contractors, and I would typify them as solar and storage contractors at this point, are the driver of the energy that's used to fuel the movement of electrification. So when I think of it is like heat pumps and all these electrified devices are very efficient at converting energy to end uses, heating, cooling, hot water, what have you. I live in San Diego. If I were to import that energy from the grid, it would cost me between 38 and 52 cents. But if I was to get it from an on-site solar system, a rooftop solar system, the levelized cost of that energy is somewhere between like 10 and 12 cents. So to the extent that I want to electrify all the things in my house, why would I not do it on the cheapest possible fuel?
Yep. And that makes total sense. And the solar contractors are savvy. They've been crunching numbers. They always look at the prospect for a homeowner to electrify based on the numbers. And you're talking about the same approach to solar and then everything else. But let's talk about everything else. What are the electrification elements that you'll be covering?
Yeah, so there's a whole host of things. I think it like starts with like in sort of descending order. So EVs, heat pumps for heating and cooling buildings, heat pumps for hot water. And those are really like the core focus and like the big drivers of energy use. And then there's a trailing set of appliances, whether that's induction cooktops or clothes dryers that we can talk about. Our initial sort of pass is just those first three big ones.
Yep. I totally agree. Those are the big ones. And it's also, when it comes to putting in an electric dryer, that's pretty easy. Heat pump dryers, I think I'd wait a little bit longer.
Yep.
The induction
Yeah,
cooktops
exactly.
are really cool, but that's, it's a $2,000 job, and it's really hard for, a contractor to make money on that unless they're kind of always doing these little home improvements. But when they're all working together, I kind of live in a house like that, and it's just absolutely terrific to see that zero or negative electric bill, where if people are able to sign up early and get the incentives in the right way. So what kind of recommendations are you going to be providing to customers? How will this service work?
Yeah, so in terms of recommendations, I think what we found is on a per home basis, there's a lot of different outcomes. So I'll take my own house as an example. I live in San Diego. I can fit up to 30 panels on my roof. Let's call the minimum set 10. So there's kind of like 20 flavors of solar panels. And then I can have one or many batteries and an EV or two EVs and heat pumps and heat pump water heaters and all the things. If you expand that set out, it actually ends up being like 1,000 possible permutations for each home, all with different economic and financial outcomes. So our positioning is like what we want to do on a per home basis is start with our set of required inputs, which is simply a house address and interval bill data. So we think of it as 15-minute or hourly electrical data, and then daily gas. And then from there, we can expand the set to everything that's possible in the house, constrained by, like, let's say, roof dimensions and shading and other things. And we can enumerate that entire set. And then once we have that set, our idea is to allow a homeowner to search the space for the thing that makes the most sense to them. So whether that is, you know, in my particular house, I have like a gas tankless hot water heater in a closet, which would be difficult to replace with a heat pump water heater today, though that might change in the future with a remodel. But I am interested in the heat pump. If I have this and I have an EV, then what is the right combination solar and storage system that would power that?
Yeah, that makes sense. And so that kind of leads us to some of the other software packages that are out there. There's a lot of solar design tools. We're using Aurora. I had used something that we developed back in 2001 that worked pretty well, and we scaled it. And there's also a lot of HVAC design tools. How is Balto going to incorporate the capabilities of these tools in your vision of these permutations that a homeowner would go through and prioritize?
Yeah, so I would say, I've worked with a lot of HVAC tools, certainly have seen Aurora. I think it's a beautiful sort of rendering. I think our core competency here on the energy modeling is pulling that modeling down to an hourly basis and then being inclusive of a lot of different sort of appliances and production systems. So like solar, various batteries, heat pumps that sort of difficult to model based off of house conditions and weather patterns and heat pump water heaters. But because these things all interact, like if I were to get an EV or another EV in my case, it might affect the size of solar system I needed. I think it's important to contextualize the decision-making process with all the things in one place. So I think that that is like unique and novel. Outside of that, I think we've just got a deep background in some of the more difficult aspects of this. I would say heat pumps are probably the biggest one, where if you need to predict the outcome on an hourly basis, there's a very rigorous modeling approach and then a verification approach after that that's required.
Is that verification approach kind of comparing it to the annual therms that they're using?
So what we do is we actually use the bills to calibrate an energy model. So I've done a bunch of energy modeling in the past, and I think the key difference here is now that we have access to more granular bill data, what we've done in the past is build these very black box models, physics-based models that are like ground up, where maybe you're going to the site and you're measuring things, whether it's installation levels or number of windows or, orientation. Now what we can do is build a model sort of side by side with the bills and use the two things to calibrate it together. And what actually falls out is a very accurate model that you can suss out things like people's, preference on set point temperature or when they're home, things that end up driving hourly energy consumption. And that's a really important thing today. And that's a difference, now from 2 years ago, where we could use generalizations or yearly consumption. Now we really have to understand it on an hourly basis, because that's when the billing takes place and that's how the homeowner is going to experience it in terms of dollars.
Yeah, so the hourly stuff kind of brings in the headaches that we in the solar industry have in California under the new net billing tariff, and how that's kind of quicksand from the perspective of the installers, because the utilities keep changing parameters. But it's a really hard thing to figure out, even with the tools that we're using now, to figure out, what's the best decision as far as putting in a battery system, and especially how to operate that with the way the net billing tariffs provide kind of daily or hourly incentives depending on what time of year it is. So how is Balto going to improve on that?
Yeah, so I think first of all, it has to be all inclusive. So it has to involve all the appliances again. Secondarily, all of our modeling is done on an hourly basis, including export rates. So what we're doing is it's essentially like an optimization problem for like the amount of solar, given the electrified appliances in the house, what is the optimal amount of solar and storage that leads to the best financial outcome, which is integrated on an hourly basis, right? So like sometimes for the majority of the year or hours under NEM 3, it's disadvantageous to export to the grid, but there are a set of hours in August and September where it's hugely advantageous. So what we're doing is like just incrementing up sizes, and again going through like 1,000 scenarios on a per home basis to find what is the best, what is the optimal for that specific homeowner.
Yeah, I'd love to have that capability with what we're doing. Basically, we recommend that customers get a battery and sometimes two, and then sometimes they want more, but then we can't find space for it. But it's not very granular. It's just one lump, two lumps, or three lumps. And then, we kind of help them through to see how those economics are going to be. But, when the battery prices start coming down and when the building codes relax a little bit so we can put more in more effectively, that'd be really, really great. What kind of data do you need from customers? For solar, we just get the utility data, whether it's hourly or every 15 minutes, and get the natural gas therms. But what other information do you need from the customers?
Yeah, so at bare minimum to start, we need a house address so we can locate it. And then we need interval bill data, gas and electricity. So again, on the electricity side, it's 15 minutes or hour, and gas, the highest resolution we can get is daily today. So we absolutely need those two things to start. I've done a ton of energy modeling in the past. One of the things that I found is the best site observed data on energy use is actually bills. So like an order of magnitude more important than everything else. We are developing a site-based form with the team at Northern Pacific. We're doing a pilot with in Naples, Marin, Sonoma. And that allows you to amend some of the assumptions that we're making on a building stock level, right? So through scraping a bunch of sources, we can, make assumptions around what kind of heating system or hot water system you have. Those are reasonably accurate to the extent that we have site specific knowledge that leads us to believe something's different. We have the ability to input and change those things. It's not a requirement. It's a refinement, I would say.
And so you can look at the electrical and the gas, and you can say you must have a heat pump. Or,
Yep.
That's okay. That's pretty smart. So kind of the next steps after you've done that modeling from real data, how do you kind of figure out what the economics are? The incentives for electrification, they vary by the device, the county and the state, and kind of however the IRA incentives are trickling down through the DOE to the states and anything else local from utilities. So is there a database of incentives, or are you gathering those from Rewiring America, or how do you incorporate those?
Yes, I think for me, I would separate the problem at the start to, in terms of like describing economics to a homeowner, as the operating expenses over time and the capital expenses. On the operate, I think our core competence is on the operating expenses side. So it's like if we site devices in a house, whether that's solar storage or a heat pump, how do these things work on an hourly basis? And then given the end result, which is like a, you know, KWH in a period, how does that roll up to a bill eventually? On the CapEx side, we're working with contractors to understand and implement the cost of the system. So that's like the big chunk. And then on the incentive side, I would say it's like a little bit of a different problem, right? So that one is like, it's mutable. It changes a lot over time. I don't think that I know that that's not our core competency. So we use like a service from Eli, which is a company in the space that factors rebates for individuals based on, let's say, geography, income, all the things. And that's incorporated in the model as well.
Yeah, basically what we've done for these IRA incentives is we're just sticking with the tax credits, because it's so easy to get a customer who here in Silicon Valley wanted to get the $8,000 heat pump rebate that the DOE through the IRA was talking about for the last 2 years. And then, bingo, suddenly when the rules come out as interpreted by the California Energy Commission, that $8,000 is really only if you're low income, and if you're middle income, you get $4,000. And if you're not middle income, which, the threshold is like $275,000, you basically get nothing. So it's really tricky, and we hate when we kind of overpromise to customers and they think they're going to get incentives. So we're just very, very conservative, just talking about the tax credits. And we mentioned that there might be others, but they're kind of sometimes very, very tricky to get.
I agree with that. Like, so the basis of our modeling and the highest leverage point is the tax credit, the ITC. My understanding, when I think of IRA, I think of, messaging around like $8,000 a heat pump. My understanding of it is that, the HERO program is rolling out now. The Homes program will roll out in about a year. We haven't incorporated any of those, though we intend to through Eli when they become available. To be honest, they're not necessary to show strong financial returns for homeowners today. We will take them when they're available, and we hope to access them through a third party, but they're not required to make this work today.
Yeah. All right. So what's the homeowner experience going to be with Balto? And is it conveyed via contractors or via Balto itself, finding contractors? I understand it's a software as a service business, but talk about it as how you would interact with customers.
Yes, our goal is to provide tools, the sort of discovery tools for homeowners to better understand a range of potential options and their outcomes. As a very tactical go-to-market, we are working through solar contractors in California, specifically the North Bay to start. And the message will be delivered through them. We're providing the tooling. They're the ones that have incoming customers, homeowners who have expressed interest in solar. And what we feel our position here is a couplefold. One is to do the computational work to describe various value propositions and be able to rank order them. So that's one thing. And then two is to decrease friction in the system by providing instruments that allow you to chunk out the capex. So all the expenses. So if it's a 10 kilowatt system and 2 batteries and a heat pump, it gets to be expensive. How do we finance that in a way that you can experience the capex in the same cadence as the bill savings?
So to what degree do you think you could integrate financing with the value proposition of Balto?
I think it's absolutely critical. The two critical things for me are, how do you deliver the value proposition? And then how do you finance it? And on the latter, it's to the extent that these projects become large, let's say $50,000 plus, if our view of the world is that people will have that amount of disposable capital to put against this, even if the savings are tremendous, I think will constrain the market. And some of the learnings from the past, whether it was Solar City or Dandelion, is like to the extent that you can like again have the spend and the savings in the same like monthly cadence. We've seen a lot more adoption there. So I think it's absolutely critical.
Yeah, no, the financing definitely makes sense. Our experience going way, way back, but especially now that we're providing more complete electrification services is, we look at solar and storage as our bread and butter. And it also, as we discussed earlier, it's the thing that makes the most sense right off the bat. And then every time you add on something else, especially a heat pump HVAC system, I mean, that's $20,000 to $30,000 minimum. And then the customers, they're saying, well, should I put in the heat pump or should I put in the solar? Candidly, we think it makes more sense for the customer to put in the solar. But the homeowners may say, my old VAC is bad, I got to do that now. So without financing, it's much more likely that they're just going to do one or two things. And if you can give them financing for everything, that's a home run. Are there any government loan programs that would help with that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, we think of it less as a loan. I'm happy to go into it. One quick point on this before we move on to I'm happy to go deep in the financing. In terms of like the heat pump versus solar, I think our position on that is in the past, the very best solar contractors were looking at, 12 months historical bills and then sizing solar arrays to meet those demands. Obviously, that's changed a little bit with NEM3. Like our vision of this is that the future will look a lot different. The future of energy consumption will look a lot different than the past, whether that's through the adoption of EVs or heat pumps or heat pump water heaters or induction stoves, or the list goes on. Our view is what we want to do is use existing bills to calibrate a model and then forecast what all these electrified appliances do to the load, the hourly load, and then get a shared vision with a homeowner on what the future looks like. And with that shared vision, build 20-year renewable systems, solar and storage, to meet that load. So in your case, I would say that if someone was like, should I do a heat pump or should I do solar? Well, clearly you should do both over time. But I would start with the solar that's sized appropriately to do all the things that you anticipate doing. So it doesn't end up being like a patchwork down the road.
Yeah. And then we have to contend with the utilities who don't want you to add on to the system, and it just makes it extraordinarily difficult to do. But right now, basically, when we're working with customers and they want to get an EV and they're probably going to put in a heat pump, we just basically size it as big as we can. I think there's a 150% cap on historic usage. Sometimes they're going to need more than that. And then from the other perspectives, historically, I've had customers that put in more than they needed. I've never, ever, ever in almost 25 years had a customer come back to me and say, gee, we put on too much solar. Never happened.
Yeah, no, exactly. I agree with that wholeheartedly.
Yeah. All right. So, I'm familiar with the work that you're doing with Northern Pacific Power, Andrew Krause, and, we're definitely looking at participating in that, probably in January or so when we kind of get through the end of this year, and love to kind of see how it works here for our Silicon Valley customers, who I think are pretty similar to what they're seeing up in Napa and Sonoma. A lot of big homes, a lot of higher income people that are interested in doing it, but then a lot of other smaller homes. We're doing a lot in the smaller neighborhoods, and they're just putting in, a small Mitsubishi or Carrier system and 6 or 7 kilowatts of solar, and that's all that fits on the roof. And boy, when they're done, they're just absolutely delighted. So give me a little bit of an idea on when Balto's going to start to be ready for contractors and customers to use. I understand starting up in Napa and Sonoma, but how about elsewhere?
Yeah, so I would start with saying that like it's a pretty nuanced problem, right? So like computationally rigorous, and there are geographic nuances as well, right? So like if you port from geography to geography, we're changing utilities, which is rates and the way that they're sort of implemented. We're changing weather, which drives like, heat pump, heating and cooling. For a lot of reasons, I think it's important for us to kind of go to bedrock in one area first and then make sure this all works. And then when you expand the set or add in different flavors like, weather files for our modeling inputs or utility rates. We're ready to do that. We want to make sure that we're not going wide, we're going deep first. So that's the reason to go in the North Bay. And we're spinning up the pilot as we speak. I'll be in Sonoma at the end of the month, and we'll go from there. After that, well, actually, before I get to the after, we have like three goals in this pilot. The first goal, and I think the overarching sense is like we want to make sure that a lot of contractors are not on the bleeding edge. Andrew and Northern Pacific have volunteered themselves, and they're great partners to do this. There's a lot of learnings to be had. We want to be able to have those learnings and then distribute them out to everyone. So not everyone has to incur the brain damage in doing this. And then the next version of it, I think, will be more consumable. On that pilot, we think of it as like a 30 home pilot. We want to sort of de-risk or prove three key points. One is that it is actually the bundling of services. It's not just solar and storage, and it's not just heat pumps, but it's like all the things, when done in tandem, lead to the best financial outcome for homeowners. So we want to demonstrate that through traction. We also want to demonstrate that if we remove a barrier and friction with financing, given strong economics, people will be willing to sort of overnight transform their home from like, completely tethered to the grid, whether it's electricity and gas, to like, 85% self-consumption of your own energy generation. And then third is that the local contractors are going to drive this, and we're there to support them. And the ways in which this will happen will vary widely, and may go from like mild to wild. It could be that we provide a service that shows or illustrates electrification, and the contractors are still their core competency and their willingness is to do solar and storage, but they're just describing other end states. And then we're also seeing contractors who are willing to integrate more trades, whether it's in-house or through partnerships, to deploy like a complete system. And I think, Barry, this is kind of like what you've done, right? It's almost like full integration of electrification.
Yeah, it's really hard, but the biggest step that we took was bringing on board HVAC and getting an HVAC license and hiring crews to do that. But, we're now regularly starting to go to a house, and, we just did one last week. We're doing another one in a couple weeks where, we're going to put in the rooftop solar. We're upgrading their electric panel. We're putting in a battery. We're installing heat pump HVAC system. And so it's a complete suite of electrification things. So, sometimes we throw in an EV charger and things like that. And 3 trucks pull up to the house, and, a couple days later, it's all done. Now, the ticket for that is $50,000 to $100,000, which is a ridiculous amount of money. But that's before the credits, and there's a lot of money that can be offset with that. But once there's financing, it's going to take off. I'm kind of curious about, I don't know if you've had any feedback or insight from HVAC contractors, because they seem to kind of think about, they just want to replace the gas furnace or fix the fan motor instead of really try and sell a heat pump and then talk about solar. Any experience with HVAC contractors?
Well, a lot in the past, especially through Dandelion. And I also have a C20 license, and I've installed a lot of these things myself. I think the reason for us to start with solar contractors is they're the ones who have historically had the conversation about energy and savings based on a set of products in a way that I don't think that HVAC contractors, the majority that I have talked to, do not have the same conversations. A lot of what I've heard in that space, like let's say we're talking about like air conditioner, and there's like, a 14 SEER and a 16 and a 19 SEER. It's kind of like couched as like a miles per gallon thing and not like a end energy or bill outcome. I think they'll get more comfortable over time, and I hope to find contractors that are willing to speak in those terms. I do think that we'll see a lot of them get pulled into this electrification movement because the heating and cooling systems are such a predominant load. But I do think that it is going to start with partnerships, and it could involve, as is your case, into, all under one roof. I know Northern Pacific's partnered with a company in the North Bay as well that does a wide range of heat pumps and also gas furnaces and things like that. So they're generally, I would say that they seem to be more agnostic on, fuel source and product. And, we're hoping that we can show that there's demand and traction for, specifically heat pumps.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And most of the HVAC contractors that we've come across with have exactly the same profile. And they're much more willing to just replace an old air conditioner with a new air condenser unit outside, or replace an old gas furnace with a new one, than start to bring up the conversation of heat pumps and then start to talk about long-term economics. But yeah, they're the same all over. Well, have you electrified your home down in San Diego?
And so I'm in the process. Let me the overview where I'm at. I moved in 3 years ago from the East Coast, and immediately at that point was like, I'm going to put a solar system on. So I have a 10 kilowatt solar system. I didn't put a battery in at the time. I am grandfathered in an M2, and it was my understanding that there weren't a lot of outages. I have not experienced one to date in San Diego, though it seems to be creeping down from the north, Escondido in particular. To the extent that this becomes a thing, I will be like, it will take one outage for me to get a battery. So I anticipate at some point that will happen. I do have an EV. That is my vehicle. I actually don't drive a lot, but Solar City Tesla routes, I'm product, specific, but I love it. It's great. There's no maintenance. It's easy to charge. It's great. On the HVAC side, we're kind of embarking on a remodel here. And as part of it, we're going to put in ground source heat pump. And this is, historic roots things with dandelion. So that will do heating and cooling, obviously. And then my hot water system, I think I mentioned earlier, I think as part of that remodel, like there's an opportunity for a heat pump water heater. It might be the one thing that ends up being more difficult space wise. Again, with a tankless gas water heater in my house right now, we just have to find the space for it.
Yeah. That's the big disadvantage is I look at people with tankless systems or people in condos with a little closet, and it's really hard to put the heat pump water heater in there.
Yep. No, I totally agree. And that's like in our tooling, like what we're doing is saying, this might be the best financial outcome, but if there's a reason, if I were to use this tool, I would deselect the heat pump water heater at the start, not because I was not convinced by the economics, but just logistically, like it's the more difficult one for me.
Yeah. I was fascinated that you were at Dandelion because you took the horizontal trench approach for the heat exchanger in the ground. And back in the early 80s, I was working with a company called MegTech doing the analysis and the R&D on it. And we were drilling very deep wells in Boston area and, basically the same thing. Lots and lots of potential. And I think the horizontal trenching makes more sense just because the digging is going to be less than what we were experiencing with big, deep wells. But love the idea. But in the meantime, air-to-air heat exchangers are just becoming so ubiquitous and reliable that they're getting a lot of traction. We'll see where that goes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that the performance of particularly cold climate heat pumps has improved a lot. A big thing. I will say that a lot of in the US, there's this notion that heat pumps are a new technology, which is just definitively not true. They're probably hundreds of millions, if not billions of heat pumps in the world. This is a very proven technology that we're just starting to adopt now.
Yeah, and traveling to Asia, they were pretty much everywhere. And then, we started seeing them pop up here in hotels and, now we're installing them pretty regularly. All right, so the question that I had, where did the name Balto come from?
So it's a sled dog reference. So the story is there was a diphtheria outbreak in Alaska in the early 1900s. There was no way to get a vaccine to a small town there. So a sled dog sort of relay was set up, and Balto was running the third leg of that relay through a storm, was supposed to pass the vaccine off to the next team. When they got to that camp, team was not ready and was incredulous that this dog could have made it through the storm. So Balto ran the last leg himself and saved the town. Number one, it was just a movie that I'd seen with my kids. So that was one thing. Second thing is I'm super proud of the work that's been done in the renewable space, particularly rooftop solar in the last, let's say 20 years, right? This is a real industry. Does feel like there's one final leg, at least, to get us to sort of mainstream. And it does feel, on one hand, I totally get it because, this NEM3 thing has really shaken the industry. And if you read the headlines, it's a lot of doom and gloom, and the industry's down 80% year over year. I'm appreciative of the pain that has caused a lot of people. I do believe that this is an amazing opportunity as well, where we can take this sort of net metering paradigm and transform it into something that spurs the industry on, that delivers great customer economics, and that allows people to be self-sufficient in the energy that they produce and consume. And I think it just takes like one mental shift and the last push. And I'm super optimistic.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the self-sufficiency is so important and magnified by the rate at which electricity prices are going up. And, people are looking at that alternative, and that alternative is solar and electrifying the rest of the home and tapping into the battery that you put in, or tapping into your car. So that's definitely the trend. Sorry, we talked a lot about energy geeky stuff, but what do you do for fun?
Well, historically I've been a workaholic, but I did take 4 years off recently after Dandelion, which is doing great. Just racing another round. In that time, I picked up some first of all, I mentioned that we don't drive around a lot. We live on the beach basically in San Diego. The kids and I love biking around. We spend a lot of time on bikes, going to beaches. In the last several years, I've been starting to climb a bunch and do a lot of like open water swimming. I would have said like, a year ago before Balto, this was a multiple time a week thing for me. Now it's less so, but as we ramp this thing up, like this is now the thing that's exciting and interesting. So I'm putting a lot of effort behind it, and yeah, we'll see where it goes.
All right, that's cool. Well, how can people get in touch with you at Balto?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way, we've got a form on our website, like a, sort of an interest form that we monitor closely. Really what we want to do in this pilot is take as many people along for the ride as they'd like in a way that's the least brain damaging possible. So like we're like super open books about everything. We want to be able to show both our progress and our learnings. So if you sign up on the website, it's a good way for us to keep you in the loop as we go forward. We'll outbound to that list, and we're planning a couple, to the extent that people are willing to travel, some meetups and show and tells in the North Bay. And then, again, we want to go to bedrock there. We want to make sure that we have this problem solved. And then when that's true, we want to expand it, obviously, and, throughout California is the first step.
All right, that's really, really cool. I'm glad we had this discussion, and there's just so much overlap with what you're doing, with what we're doing, and where we've been and where we're going. But right now, that's all the time we have on this week's Energy Show. James, thanks for joining me on this show, and thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. If you missed any of today's show, you can always go to the Energy Show website at energyshow.biz and listen to the podcasts.
This episode of The Energy Show was proudly sponsored by Sunlight and Power, the Bay Area's leading commercial and residential solar contractor. SLP has been designing and installing photovoltaic, battery backup, and solar thermal solutions since 1976. Help fight climate change. Go solar with Sunlight and Power today.